Good day everyone, welcome back to the channel. This is Some Christian Guy and you can find me on Facebook, YouTube one way and on BitChute. Now today I want to talk to you guys about what it means to be an empath, or rather to define the phenomena in a more scientifically rigorous way. Now and I'm basically here to tell you that there is actually no such thing as an empath. Although people with very high and very sensitive degrees of empathy do exist, but the entire formulation of what it means to be an empath has sort of run off on a tangent with a lot of people, and is in a lot of ways ventured out of proper mainstream psychology and ventured into the world of spiritualism. So for the most part, you get people who talk about psychics and all these kinds of things. It sort of ended up in that realm, and as one can expect, that when it ventures into that realm of things, you basically get a lot of nonsense, a lot of stuff that is not true. And now, as an individual who through my church gets involved with outreach and charitable work, and we try to help people with various issues, the fact of the matter is that if we want to be effective at helping other people with whatever problems it might be, even if it's basically just about understanding their own selves and how they relate to the world, we need to make sure that what we are discussing is valid. That if we're going to put labels on certain things, if we're going to start describing and defining certain things, that these descriptions and these definitions are valid. Because the problem is if they are invalid, if our constructs are invalid, from that, usually the consequence is that people then begin to make prescriptions from these ideas and stuff like that. And if the concept is invalid, then the prescriptions are going to then be invalid as well. They're not going to be particularly useful. So for the most part, when you look out there and you look for what does it mean to be an empath, you have a whole bunch of definitions and things of that sort, but it doesn't, it basically, it gets to the point where oh, well, I'm an empath. Well, what now? Okay, and they're not particularly helpful, and there a lot more understanding can actually be achieved if you properly define exactly and parse out exactly what is going on. But essentially, so for example, this actually tacks on in some way to a video I did, I think yesterday or the day before, where I basically said there is no such thing as emotional intelligence. So interestingly enough, the issue of emotional intelligence and the issue of being an empath, they actually overlap a lot, because what these people are trying to get at is in a lot of ways, they're actually trying to get more or less at the same thing. People are very sensitive and so on and so forth. But when we're talking about an empath specifically, we are now going into the very heightened, very sensitive ability of some people to be able to know and feel and experience what other people are feeling. And I do in fact know someone like this who her degree of empathy is so highly tuned that she is often able to identify an emotion in another person even before that individual is able to identify that emotion within themselves. And so we need to ask what is going on. And a lot of people then begin to believe that this is some sort of almost supernatural sort of ability or spiritual ability, something that science cannot explain, and so on and so forth. And none of these things are true. None of these things are true. These things are actually very well understood. And because in the vast majority of cases, people do not actually consult the proper literature, they go off on very funny beliefs. So let's get stuck into it. Right, and please let's understand, my aim here is not to disparage or mock or ridicule people or anything like that, or to demolish people or break people down in any way. But if it really is that if we're going to be as effective as possible when dealing with people, because that's the intention, you want to be as effective as possible, as helpful as humanly possible. So in order to do that, you have to know You have to get things right as much as possible. If you genuinely care about other people in any way, shape, or form, then you should also really, really care about passing these things out correctly, so that you don't actually risk doing more injury than you otherwise would, right? Or doing more injury than is otherwise already present. Okay, so let's have a look quickly. Basically, if you do a Google search, you will find empath, chiefly in science fiction, and that's actually true for most of the time. When you hear the word empath, it usually is in science fiction. A person with a paranormal ability to perceive mental or emotional state of another individual, and it's often associated with clairvoyance and telepathy and all of these kinds of things, right? And the use over time for the word empath, we as we can see, since the 1960s, we've seen a very, very sharp increase in the prevalence or the use of this word. It's really, really become significantly more popular over time. And it should be no surprise that we start seeing here in the 1960s, between the 1960s, 1980s, and now in 2000, that there's this sharp increase. Because what happened over here? You had the hippie movement, did you not? Right? The hippie movement, and was all about love one another and all of these kinds of things. And people started becoming very, very much more interested in these sorts of things, to the point now where we are in a time now in the world where emotions trump everything. Trump absolutely everything, especially in this world of postmodernism, where emotions are the paramount thing. You're not allowed to offend anyone. You're not allowed to you cannot say boo to a goose, basically, anymore. And it's gotten out of hand. It really has gotten out of hand. You see people running around. They no longer have the ability to control their emotions. They've become you see a lot of what you call emotional lability. That means the inability to control emotions. You hear a lot about safe spaces. People want to be safe spaces. They want to protect their emotions. People are very concerned with being triggered and being overwhelmed and all these sorts of things. And you sort of wonder, and you sort of see, it's interesting that as we see the incline of the popularity of the word empath, we are at the same time seeing quite a pronounced increase within the overall society with concerns for these kinds of things, to the point where it's actually becoming malignant, where people seem to no longer be able to control their emotions at all, and what one feels is the governing principle for all actions and all decision making in the world today. And as we can see in a lot of cases, that this is actually not a good thing at all. One needs to have, anyone that knows, that has any goodwill or any honesty whatsoever, will recognize that we need a balance between the intellectual powers and the emotional powers. And one of the biggest problems that this has caused specifically is it's aggravated the animosity between the genders, between men and women, because as one can expect, predictably, if we look at what's called the big five personality traits, we find that women on average are significantly higher in agreeableness, which is the dimension for empathy and compassion and all these kinds of things. Women are significantly higher, so then predictably we will see that there is a problem. And the problem in the world today is people always err in the extreme. Right? So for example, the battle of the sexes can basically, in a lot of ways, obviously I'm oversimplifying it, it boils down to men are disagreeable, women are highly agreeable or highly compassionate, men are disagreeable and they generally lack compassion and empathy and all these kinds of things. And both of them think that their way is the best. Rather than meeting together and assessing about how do we proceed forward together and use the strengths of both sides, each one is completely convinced that their way is the only way, and men insist that women need to be more like men, and women insist that men need to be more like women, and the whole thing is an absolute social catastrophe, and no one is able to even get along anymore, and the whole battle of the sexes has really gotten out of hand, right? So let's continue. So just so that we can see, one thing that you'll find in Anomaly is that what I did is I went in the first I googled empath and definition and all that kind of thing, and I literally opened up the first on the first page, all of the websites on the very first page. And one thing you will notice is that for the most part, as we would expect if we look at personality traits, the ones that are most concerned with empathy and the whole concept of empath are women. And this is to be expected. Obviously, this is to be expected. Lena Firestone. Here we have Psychology Today, 10 Traits Empathetic People. And it's, again, the same lady as this website. Again, it's a woman that is most concerned about it, and so on and so forth. And then we have one exception where in this particular website, the one who is writing about it is, in fact, a male. So it is obviously quite possible that men can be very, very high in agreeableness, high in sensitivity, and all these kinds of things. But in the vast majority of cases, the ones that are the most concerned about these issues are in fact women. And you even have here, now here's the interesting, Judith Orloff, MD. She is in fact a psychologist, so she's qualified. And here I am before you today with the absolute audacity to tell you that there is no such thing as an empath, and yet here is someone who is qualified saying that empathy is a power and all these kinds of things. And you even have people go so far as to say to even equate an empath or this power of empath to actually be some sort of a superpower, some great advantage or something like that. And we're actually going to find that this is actually not necessarily the case. Now, we need to lay the groundwork. There is no such thing as an empath. No such thing whatsoever, right? When we are talking about empath, and we're going to see some of the definitions that these people, because the science fiction one wasn't particularly helpful, right? It gives us a clue, but not particularly helpful to define what it is that people are talking about when they are using this word. You are going to find, if you look at my other videos where I deal in the big 5 personality traits, you will find that almost every single thing that they talk about when they are talking about people who are empaths, all of the traits, every single one of them, fall primarily under 2 traits of personality, namely agreeableness and neuroticism, right? Just those 2 traits alone account for almost every single thing that people are referring to when they are talking about empaths and empathy and all of these kinds of things, right? And so, again, rather than trying to figure out something and trying to put your finger on the pulse of something that actually does not exist, if you look at personality trait theory, you have something that is scientifically rigorous. It can give you a quantitative value, it can give you a qualitative assessment, and it's got predictive power, and so on and so forth. It is absolutely excellent. If you are an individual that is interested, and even if you suspect that you are an empath, I will predict, and this is how you can know it's valid. If you suspect that you are an empath and you go and you do a personality test, I guarantee you that you are going to score very, very high in agreeableness, and you are going to score either in the middle, depending on how much of an empath you are. You are going to score either in the middle, so it's in your 50th or over percentile in agreeableness, and you are going to, generally speaking, going to find that you are going to score in either the 40th or the 50th percentile or greater in trait neuroticism. Okay, and you can go and do that, and you know, if you go and do that and you find that that's the case, I would be very, very interested. Let me know in the comment section what your results to be. But generally speaking, you're going to find that you're going to be quite high in those 2 traits, and we're going to find out here why that is in fact the case. Right, now let's go and quickly have a look what people are talking about when they're referring. So basically what I found is that all of these websites are basically giving you sort of the 10 traits of empathy. This one gives you the 13 signs of empathy, and this one, what are empaths, and so on and so forth, and gives all the things, right? 10 traits again. So this is the same lady as that one, so she gives the same 10 again. Psychology Today. So this is something that's taken quite seriously by a lot of people. And then this gentleman then lists 13 signs again here as well. Let's go to the Psychology Today article and have a look. And it says here the following: the trademarks of an empath is feeling and absorbing other people's emotions and or physical symptoms because of their high sensitivities. These people filter the world through their intuition and have a difficult time intellectualizing their feelings. As a psychiatrist and empath, I know the challenges of being a highly sensitive person. When overwhelmed with the impact of stressful emotions, empaths may experience panic attacks, depression, chronic fatigue, food, sex, and drug binges, or exhibit many other physical symptoms that defy traditional diagnosis. Now, this is very, very interesting that she would say this. Now, it actually can be explained why this is in fact the case. Right, if you look at personality traits and the excesses of personality traits, you will find that the excesses of personality traits start venturing into what we call personality disorders of personality. So if you, for example, go into the Diagnostic Statistics Manual, the fifth one, you will find under Cluster B personality disorders, you will find, so for example, borderline, codependent, narcissism, and psychopathy, right? Otherwise known as the sociopaths. Now, this is something that needs to be said. One of the reasons why we can say there's no such thing as an empath is because literally everyone on the planet, right, with the exception of a very few minority, has empathy, right? Everyone, whether men or women, even though men generally score lower, everyone will score on the agreeableness dimension, right? We call it's a spectrum. So when you do your personality test, you get your score on agreeableness, openness, and so on and so forth. And you will generally find that people who are, again, remember I said you will score high in agreeableness and high in neuroticism. You will generally also find that you will score quite high in a trait that's called openness. So people that are very open to experience or open to receive sort of the how can you say, all of the signals coming in from around them, very, very highly open. And people who are empaths, you will find that openness breaks down into intellect and creativity. You will find that empaths generally skew towards the creativity rather than the intellect, as what has been put forward here and recognized by the psychologist here. So everyone will score somewhere on the spectrum of agreeableness. Literally everyone. So everyone has empathy. Absolutely everyone has empathy, right? So this idea that there are some special people that feel empathy more, or it is absolute nonsense. Everyone has empathy. The only people that do not have any empathy whatsoever are people that are identified by the two personality disorder classifications, and that is people who are narcissists, but full-on narcissists. We're talking about someone who has a clinical diagnosis of narcissism as well as psychopathy. These people have absolutely no empathy, no compassion whatsoever. None. It simply doesn't exist. And the reason why they are like that is because all personality issues, right? Personality disorders are disorders that arise out of trauma, right? These are symptoms of trauma, usually in the majority of cases, childhood trauma, sexual abuse, physical abuse, verbal abuse, unsafe environment, etc., etc. And so in a sense, one can say that these personality disorders are not only a symptom, but in a way they are in fact a coping mechanism that these individuals have been forced to adopt in order to deal with a world that was hostile to them. And so when we see people like this, whether they are people, even the narcissist and the psychopath, who generally, these are people we love to hate, we need to feel we need in general to acknowledge that the reason they are this way is because there was a rather severe trauma when they were growing up, severe abuse of some kind, physical, psychological, sexual, whatever the case might be. All right. And that is why they are that way. And usually what we are finding, and what we are finding increasingly, is that the best way to actually assist these people to become better is to actually give them the same treatment that you would give to someone that is experiencing post-traumatic PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder, or even complex post-traumatic stress disorder, and also subject them to what we call cognitive behavioral therapy, where they assess and go through their natural responses to things. And it is actually very, very, very highly effective if we treat them, if we expose them to these kinds of therapies. Now, when we look at the definition here, right, if we go back to the definition, I want to focus here where she says, when overwhelmed with the impact of stressful emotions, experience panic attacks, depression, chronic fatigue, food, sex, and drug binges. It is because of that, right? The chronic fatigue, the sex binges, the panic attacks, the depression, those are very, very typical of someone who is very, very high in trait neuroticism. Right? People who are high in trait neuroticism are almost guaranteed to experience those kinds of things on a regular basis. Neuroticism is known as the negative emotion dimension, as another way of putting it. Anxiety, fear, feelings of worthlessness, and so on and so forth. And what happens is that one of the reasons which a lot of people have failed to grasp is that the reason a person becomes an empath, for example, that they can sense what other people are feeling and even what's coming, is in a lot of times that is a response again of a personality disorder, where the person is using that as a defense mechanism. So you become one of the properties that you find in people who are very, very high in trait neuroticism, that's experience high anxiety and high fear and all of these kinds of things, is what is something that is called hypervigilance. Hypervigilance. Someone that is hypervigilant is, imagine like a little mouse, for example. A little mouse is eaten by almost everything, right? Is eaten by cats, is eaten by dogs, is eaten by weasels, is eaten by owls, eaten by everything. Wants to eat the poor little mouse. And so as a necessary survival mechanism, the mouse becomes hypervigilant, right? Any little rustle in the bushes and the sensors are there, and I'm looking for danger. And this is essentially what is happening to someone who is high neuroticism, and as a result becomes hypervigilant, because they're so naturally fearful and anxious and all these kinds of things that they are immediately alert and open to dangers and to all of the visual and the cues and all of these kinds of things, visual and verbal cues that other people put out, because it is in a way of detecting danger before the danger actually happens. So this is why generally you will find that people who are described as empaths can tell even before the person actually gets angry. They can tell even when that little seed of anger is there, they can immediately tell. And you will find that often, if you go into the person's history, that they might have been exposed to a lot of violence as children, and as a survival mechanism, for example, let's say you had an abusive father or an abusive mother, as a survival mechanism, it would be very useful to be able to tell when your mother or father is on the way to exploding completely, and so that if you can detect that, then you can make sure that then you can make yourself scarce, so that they then don't take that anger out on you, and it becomes a bit of a survival mechanism, as it were. And you find here, so for example, if we look here, it says here, the trademark of an empath is feeling and absorbing other people's emotions and or physical symptoms because of their high sensitivities. Now, here's what's going on that you will generally find. When you look at personality disorder, right, you see there's two personality disorders known as borderline and codependent. Right? Borderline and codependent. Now, here's the interesting thing. Generally speaking, narcissism and psychopathy, most of the time, are males. However, borderline and codependence are usually women. For the most part, are usually women. And this is very, very interesting. And again, it is predictable, because if you look at personality trait theory and you look, men generally score higher in lower in agreeableness, so they're usually very disagreeable. Lower in conscientiousness, so they're very low in conscientious. The rules and things like that don't apply. They break rules, they don't mind, which is quite typical of a narcissist and a psychopath. However, women are very high in compassion and all of these kinds of things. High in conscientious, they like the rules, they like to all this, and high neuroticism. So in neuroticism you have volatility and withdrawal. So volatility, they're emotionally labile. So 1 minute they're happy, the next minute that's typical of someone when you think about things like manic depression or bipolar disorder and things of these sorts. The emotions are up and down and left and right and center, all over the place. And you find that generally that is the domain of women. Now, one of the problems, right, with all of these personality traits, whether it is narcissism or whether it is psychopathy or whether it is borderline. So, for example, let's take the example of narcissism. When a person is a narcissist, because of all the trauma that they suffer in the world, there is a concept that we need to make sure that we understand in order to realize what is going on with people, right? So, in every single person, you have what's called internal objects and external objects, right? And a healthy person is able to distinguish between what is an internal object and what is an external object, right? So, and your internal object, for example, is your conscience, right? The voice that you hear when you think to yourself, or the voice that you hear when you do something that you know you're not supposed to, and your conscience sort of speaks to you in a sense. It's that inner voice and what you feel inside, right? Where you know. And so, for example, for example, let's say I feel awkward in a particular situation. And yet I look out and I can see there is no legitimate reason for me to feel awkward. I'm able to distinguish between the internal object and say, this is an internal object and not an external object. So there is no so even though I might feel fear or awkwardness inside, there is no legitimate reason, there is no corresponding object outside that legitimizes me to feel this way, right? There is no actual threat or whatever the case might be. So I'm able to distinguish between an internal object and an external object. What happens when you have personality disorders and things like that is that the barrier between that breaks down completely. So, for example, with a schizophrenic person, the internal object becomes the external object. So for a person who is a schizophrenic, everything is an external object, so that the voice inside of his head is no longer, like most of us would understand, is an internal voice, and you understand it's an internal voice. For a schizophrenic, this becomes an external voice that is externally telling them, which is why they hear voices, which is why they see other people, because all of the internal objects, the imagination, the voice, whatever the case might be, becomes externalized, right? And so for the narcissist, it's actually the opposite direction, right? For a narcissist, all objects are internal objects. Every single object is an internal object, which is why, for example, a narcissist, let's say a narcissist sees you today, and today you are wearing, today you tell the narcissist that you are interested in botany. And the narcissist forms this picture of you, and off we go, and internalizes you. Right, which is why narcissists look for that internal supply. They do not recognize emotions and things like that in other people, because everything is an internal object. It's everything is internalized, right? You cease to become an external object. And if the narcissist comes to you later, and let's say he wants to grow a plant, and comes to you and I want to get knowledge from you as a botanist, and you say to her, I'm no longer a botanist, I'm now a geologist, the narcissist will have a very, very serious conflict, dissonance, and will actually lash out and become very angry with the person, because now the internal object is coming into a conflict with the external object, and then you get, for example, what's called narcissistic rage and all of these sorts of things. So a similar thing is happening with the borderline and with the codependent. When a person becomes borderline or codependent, the dividing line between an internal object and an external object becomes blurred, right? They blur that line, not necessarily as much as a psychopath or a narcissist or a schizophrenic, but that line is very much so. For on average, they can distinguish the internal and the external object quite a lot more. But what happens is a codependent person or a borderline person, that barrier is fuzzy. So basically, what happens, what these people are doing, is that the reason why they can feel so much what the other person is experiencing, even down to the physical symptoms, is because what is happening is they are literally becoming that person. They are subsuming their identity. They're under the other person's identity, right? These people identify themselves. Their own personal identity is almost non-existent, right? They require external validation a lot of the times, which is why you find people who are very. So, for example, if you look out in the world of the social justice, for example, and you find, let's say, a person from the LGBT community or the transgender, the transgender, or whatever the case might be, if you say to them, I disagree with your position, rather than saying, okay, this person disagrees with my position, instead they completely overreact and they say, you are denying my existence, right? They literally say, that's the kind of language they use. You are denying my existence. This is a genocide. You are killing us. We are under this threat. Because for them, they do not have an identity that is independent from these things. They require that constant external validation in order to have a source to have an underpinning for their personality, for their identity. And that is why you have in the world today so much of this identity politics that is going on all over the place, because there is quite literally, right? I know we call it identity politics and people like to laugh and they like to mock it, but there is literally an identity crisis. And a lot of people, for example, you find that they subsume their personality rather than being an individual. They subsume their identity into the group. So the group becomes their personality rather than them being an individual within the group. The group becomes their identity. And that is what you are generally finding with these people. And people who are very, very highly agreeable, that score very, very high in agreeableness, so much so where it is now becoming pathologized or a malignant trait. What they are doing is they are completely other person centered, right? And you will often find that if you trace this back into their childhood, the parents, for whatever reason, mollycoddled them to the point where they never developed the internal resources. So basically what you are finding is someone who does not possess the internal resources to be able to manage their emotions, to regulate their emotions, to regulate the internal and the external objects. So, for example, someone that is suffering from an anxiety disorder, their anxiety disorder, they are afraid, or a fear disorder, whatever the case might be. They're afraid whether there is in fact something to be afraid of or not. They can be surrounded by puppy dogs and kittens, and they would still feel afraid, right? Because their internal object is not corresponding properly with the external objects, and the regulation between the two is not happening in an adequate way. And it is for this reason that people like this. So, for example, generally you find that when it comes to women are quite horrified, for example, at the way men interact with each other. For example, how do men interact with each other? We insult each other all the time, right? You moron, what you doing, and stuff like that. How are you, dumbass? Whatever the case might be. That is how men interact with each other, and they never get offended. And for women, this is an absolute mystery. Why can men do that and women cannot do that without getting into a big fight? And it is precisely for this reason, right? Because in a lot of ways, women are significantly more requires to larger degrees validation from the external sources, and the ability to regulate the internal and the external is a little bit for women. Women generally internalize things. For them, in general, it is. Everything is an internal object. So, for example, a woman is much more likely for example, to believe that if she thinks she is ugly, that other people think she is ugly as well. So the internal object is, I am ugly, right? And she will externalize that and then believe that because she thinks she is ugly, she will then believe that other people think she is ugly as well. And you generally don't find this issue with men, because men are lower in agreeableness and so on and so forth. Whereas for men, they are much interested in everything being everything is an external object, They're more interested in facts and objects. Men are generally more interested in objectivity, right? You hear that word from men more often than you hear from women. The idea that facts don't care about your feelings. You're more likely to hear that from a man than you are from a woman, because men are, which is generally, again, why men are more interested in professions such as engineering, such as the hard sciences, because they're dealing with objects rather than constantly focusing on internal things. They're like, well, I don't care what I feel. This is the fact, and therefore that is what I'm going to do, and so on and so forth. So this is actually what is going on. So if you want to understand what is going on with these people and why they struggle so much, right? It is wrong to tell them, oh, you're an empath, and that there's something particularly wonderful and magical and superpower about this. It is wrong to do that, because you are then denying the person, right? It's like saying, you would never say to someone that is violent that they have a special superpower for winning wars or something like that. You would say, listen, you need to manage your aggression. It's that simple. So a lot of people get very, very upset when, especially women, when you say to them, listen, you need to regulate your emotions better. And it's not because you're trying to be a jerk or because whatever the case might be. But the fact of the matter is, if you are not able to properly manage and regulate your emotions and correctly regulate the internal and external objects, your life is going to be very, very difficult. And a lot of people who are empaths or who are struggling with borderline personality disorder, people who are codependent, people who are become then depressed and stressed and suffering from anxiety issues and stuff like that, it takes over their lives. They find it extremely, extremely difficult to go through life and without being constantly inhibited by all of these particular issues, and as a result they can become exhausted and all of these kinds of things. So one of the ways, when you're dealing with people who claim to be empathic or who struggle, so for example, another thing you will generally find, so for example, she says over here, if we go back to the article, you will see here, empaths may experience panic attacks, depression, and sex and drug binges, right? Binges. So for example, people who tend to binge, people who tend to go and use substance abuse and stuff, you will find, if you look under the personality traits and you look at conscientiousness, for example, you will find that conscientiousness, that they might generally be low. So people who do that, right? We're not saying all empaths do that, but if you are a person who's very, very high in agreeableness, yet very, very low in conscientiousness, you will find that this kind of impulse control is lacking. You are unable to regulate, because you lack the internal resources to regulate your emotions. You therefore require external substances to help you regulate your emotions, which is why generally you find that women are generally speaking are a lot more inclined to binge eat on sugary foods. So for example, we all know those people who watch Friends or whatever the case might be, we know, and even if you look at the memes, generally women are very open about the fact that when they've had a bad day or whatever the case might be, they come home, they open up a tub of ice cream and they eat from the tub with the biggest spoon they can find. And the reason for that is because ice cream is a high-fat, high-sugar substance, and dairy in itself contains a chemical that is known as a casomorph, which is actually a type of morphine, which is 1/10 the strength of actual medical used morphine, and this goes into the body and actually helps them feel a lot better. It calms them down, because what a lot of people don't understand is that fear, anxiety, depression, all of these negative emotions are actually a state of pain, or quite literally a state of experiencing pain. So it's the brain itself treats or experiences physical pain and emotional pain in the exact same way. They are both pain, and which is why if a person has a physical, like a broken leg or whatever, morphine and things like that, opioids will help the pain go away. But at the same time, we realize that people who are experiencing emotional pain will abuse the exact same substances that are used to treat physical pain. Because as far as the brain is concerned, the two are basically the same thing. They are both pain, literally brain pain states of pain which the brain is experiencing. And so we use these things like alcohol, like drugs, foods and things like that. High sugar, high fat foods have these responses. You get the body produces what we call the endorphin. The endorphin is a type of morphine, and then the morphine goes into the brain and causes a shot of dopamine, and then the dopamine makes you feel a little bit better, you calm down, and because it reduces your experience of painful emotions and things of that sort. And generally you find what happens is people who are low in conscientiousness in this way, where they lack that internal resource to regulate their own emotions, generally what happens is they become quite authoritarian and demand that rather than develop the skills to regulate their own emotions, they just begin to demand that other people change their behavior so that the external then becomes the regulator of this person's internal. So again, if you look at social justice warriors, they're constantly telling other people what they are or are not allowed to say, what they are or are not allowed to believe, what they are or are not allowed to do and think, and all of that. They tend to become highly authoritarian because their internal objects, their internal emotions, their entire emotional state is heavily dependent on external factors to help them regulate their emotions. Because if they're very low in conscientiousness, they will not possess the internal resources to basically be able to regulate those issues on their own. And so that's why that's why you see that out in the world today. And generally, again, if you look, obviously there are men and women, but in the vast majority of cases, if you look at the social justice community, in the vast majority of cases, it's women. It's women going out there and protesting, all of these kinds of things. And then you have things like the whole don't fat shame and don't slut shame and whatever. And it's interesting, for example, if we look at a man who's fat, he doesn't care. I'm fat, so what? Give me another beer. Right? The guy doesn't care, right? Yet for women, this is an absolute disaster, and they begin to force, and which is why generally husbands are forced to lie to their wives and say, yes, sweetie pie, you look absolutely wonderful in that thing, even if they look hideous. Because generally speaking, these personality types that are very high in agreeableness, very high in neuroticism, and generally fairly mid to high in openness, they rely quite heavily on external stimulus in order to regulate their internal emotions and things like that. And as a result, if there is trauma and all of these kinds of things, you will then find that if as a child the person is not encouraged to develop their own sense of individuality, right? If they're abused or whatever, because basically what happens in abuse of all kinds, basically you are developing, right? Let's say you're developing, you're growing, and then you experience, let's say you're 3 years old and you experience trauma. Trauma stunts your development at that point, and it prevents you from developing further. So even though your body gets older, your personality does not mature. And that is basically what trauma does to people, right? So for example, if you look at a grown man and he's a full-blown clinically diagnosed narcissist, most people make the mistake of treating the individual as if he is an adult. But the fact of the matter is he is not. What you are actually dealing with when you are dealing with a narcissist is you are literally dealing with a wounded child. Literally. You are literally dealing with a wounded child, and what the narcissist has done, for example, is they've subsumed their child in terms to protect themselves. They have subordinated or subsumed their personality, their individual personality, under a false personality. Right? That's what a narcissist does. But a person who is borderline, who is codependent, what they do is, rather than assume a false identity, they subsume their personality under someone else's. They go external. They subsume their personality under an external identity, so that whether that be another person, whether that be another group, and so on and so forth. And what they find, generally speaking, a lot of empaths, what they are finding is that a lot of people who are highly empathetic find that they tend to be preyed upon by narcissists. So you actually see, if you go into the literature, let's see if I can actually find it over here. Here we go. So here we go. Right, empaths are targets for energy vampires. An empath's sensitivity makes them particularly easy for energy vampires whose fear or rage can sap their energy and peace of mind. These vampires do more than drain an empath's physical energy, especially dangerous ones such as narcissists. So you see, there we go, there's the narcissist, who lack empathy and are only concerned with themselves, can make empaths believe they're unworthy and unlovable. Other vampires include the victim, the chronic talker, the drama queen, and more. Now here's the problem, right? So what they fail to recognize, the drama queen, the chronic talker, and the victim, these people will often consider themselves to be empaths as well, right? The victim, the chronic talker, the drama queen, and more. Those people will very often consider themselves to be empaths as well, right? And do you not find that victim mentality out in the world? Right, a lot of these victim mentalities and things like that are in fact a mask for narcissism. And what this individual is correctly realizing is that the narcissist does prey upon the empath. And the reason, and here's the thing, what a lot of people don't recognize or fail to recognize is that this is actually a symbiotic relationship. A lot of people will recoil at this idea. For an empath would think to themselves, for example, if you're an empath, you might think, why the hell would I benefit from being with a narcissist? Right? The narcissist is doing me injury. How can I possibly seek out? And one of the things that people fail to recognize is that people who are empaths, who are borderline, who are codependence and things like that, the reason they seek out narcissists is because the narcissist is quite happy. So for example, a healthy individual will not approve of someone subsuming their personality under themselves. So for example, I had a girlfriend who was quite happy to not have her own personality. She was quite happy for me to make all of the decisions, to tell her what to do, and all of these kinds of things. But I refused. I insisted. I said, you need to have your own mind. You have to have your own mind. You have to have your own thoughts, your own desires, your own dreams, your own wishes. Right? She did not like that at all. And so such an individual will in fact seek out a narcissist, because a narcissist is quite happy to tell her what to do, to think for her, and all of these kinds of things, is quite happy for this individual to subsume themselves under the narcissist's own ego, for example, right? So many empaths find that they are finding themselves in these very abusive, taxing, one-way relationships, and they're thinking, why am I here? Why am I involved in this relationship? And if you are an empath, what you need to realize is maybe you're not an empath, but maybe you are actually someone who has experienced some kind of trauma. You're very high in agreeableness. You're very high in neuroticism. So because of your neuroticism and that fear and anxiety, you are looking for someone who you can hide yourself under. And generally speaking, only people who are narcissists or who have narcissistic leanings are going to be satisfied with you to do that. So you want to hide yourself under, almost like the little mouse who is afraid of everything that's going to eat them, is going to want to hide themselves under a rock for protection, or hide themselves inside a hole for protection. So the empath, or the people who are might not necessarily, chances are you're not an empath. You are, maybe have a borderline disorder. You might have a codependent, so you might be codependent disorder, personality disorder, even though you're high agreeableness, which is good because you're sympathetic, but you can be so much so that your own personal self-identity ceases to exist entirely, and that is a problem. That really, really is a problem. You cannot do that. You need to be an individual. And one of the reasons, and here's the thing, being an individual is frightening, because being an individual means you stand out and you declare who you are, and you are become seen, right? So one thing that they realize is many empaths are introverts. They do not like to be seen, much like the mouse, like the little mouse. To be seen is to die, right? If the mouse is seen by the predator, what happens? The predator comes, kills the mouse. To be seen is quite literally is to die. And so for the person who is highly introverted, who is highly agreeable, and who does not possess these defense mechanisms, as for in their mind, to be seen is basically to die. So for them, the coping mechanism is to either subsume themselves behind the personality of another individual, or to recoil from social situations entirely, because for them almost the entire world represents a potential danger, right? They are less, so people like this are less interested in actual dangers. They are more concerned about potential dangers, what might go wrong. They constantly fear not what is in fact going wrong, but what might in fact go wrong. What is lurking around the corner that could possibly cause me an issue. And so a lot of these things tend to be, in a lot of ways, coping mechanisms. So when you're talking about someone who is an empath, I would very, very strongly like to suggest there is in fact no such thing as an empath, right? No such thing. And depending on where you are in the spectrum, you might just have high agreeableness, high compassion, more so than the average person, which is possible because it's on a spectrum, right? It doesn't mean other people lack compassion, and it doesn't mean that other people should feel more compassion, because all of these modes of existence are legitimate modes of existence, right? For example, someone who's very, very high in agreeableness, the higher you are in agreeableness, the more gullible you are, the easier it is to deceive you, the easier it is to manipulate you, the easier it is to take advantage of you, the easier it is to bully you, right? So that is not all good. That is not all good things. So it pays, for example, as part of the maturation process, for you to balance out that personality trait and learn to be a little bit more assertive, stand up for yourself, learn how to regulate your emotions, learn how to not be taken advantage of, be more disagreeable. So on the other end of the spectrum, where men generally lie, doesn't mean that I know women who are even lower in agreeableness than I am. That's quite a fascinating sight to see. And being low in agreeableness means people do not take advantage of you at all. It means you don't mind getting into an argument and standing up for yourself and negotiating on your own behalf and going, and you're going to get yours. But at the same time, it does mean, of course, it's not all good, because it does mean you can be insensitive, you can be thoughtless, and all of these kinds of things. So all of these things are about balancing your personality. And if you find then, right, that you are not just very, very high in empathy, right? If you find that you are tending to go beyond empathy to the point where it's actually becoming malignant, it's actually becoming pathological, to the point where this is interfering with the normal functioning of your day-to-day living, where you find that you are always in fear, you are always in anxiety, you are very easily stressed out, you are very easily harassed, and all of these kinds of things, you then need to look at your personality and trait and see, oh, maybe I'm very, very high in neuroticism. Maybe I have got some trauma in my life that has caused me to be this way, that has caused me to trade my individuality for the sake of peace and safety, right? Because that is essentially what these people are doing. They are giving up their individuality. They are trading their individuality in order to gain safety, which is often why you find that women, for example, they will tolerate a man who is very, very, very aggressive, who's very violent, and all of these kinds of things, because the logic is, it is better to have the animal on my side rather than to be rather than to have the animal against me, for example. So it is worth for these kinds of people, because the psychology can be so messed up, for the woman that is involved in a relationship of that sort, where the husband is so overly, and this can happen to men too. You get men who are completely and utterly subsumed and overpowered by their wives. It happens as well, right? But what essentially these people are doing is they're saying they are finding someone who is very, very aggressive, who's very strong, because that person, if they can subsume themselves under that individual's personality, then whatever incidental abuse that they might endure from the individual, for them is a fair trade. Because overall that person is going to represent that rock that they can hide underneath. That person can go, because they are aggressive, that person can go out there into the scary world and they can fight my battles on my behalf. They can go and deal with all of the frightening things out in the world on my behalf, so that I don't have to do it. Right? So that's why I say a lot of the time when a person who is an empath, they find that they are with people who are narcissists and things like that, it is not necessarily that you are being a victim. It is in a lot of ways a dysfunctional symbiotic relationship where the narcissist is gaining narcissistic supply, but the person who is either borderline or who is codependent is gaining a sense of security, a sense of validation, and and a sense of safety and security from being with a narcissist, because the narcissist is then this overblown sense of confidence and exuberance, and goes out and does all of these things, which then means that the borderline individual does not have to do that for his or herself. And so the remedy for this is, the first thing for you to do, right? Forget about all of this nonsense with empath and try to go and find your score, because, for example, there's an institution called the American Association for Empaths. It's abject nonsense. It's abject nonsense. For example, they believe there are 17 different categories of empaths, and one of those categories is literally, and I'm not joking, they talk about a mechanical empath. And a person who is a mechanical empath, according to these people, is very, very good at understanding machines and how to figure out machines, how they work, and all of this. This is absolute nonsense. Absolute. You can literally have zero empathy whatsoever and still be an absolutely fantastic engineer. In fact, you are more likely to be very, very good at dealing with machines if you lack empathy, because it is a purely intellectual pursuit, right? A purely intellectual pursuit, which is why most mechanics, most people that do deal with engineering are men, because men are very, very low in agreeableness. They are more object oriented than they are emotion oriented. So this is abject nonsense. And according to these people, they will even administer to you a test to find it's nonsense. This is absolute garbage. This is pseudoscience. If you really want to know where it is that you lie, I encourage you, please, I will put the link in the description. Go and do a personality test and be honest in the personality. Do not be overly critical of yourself. Do not be overly harsh on yourself. Do not be overly optimistic about yourself. Try and be as sober as possible and get someone who you trust to even help you with that. Go and do the personality test. Have a look through the personality test. How high are you in openness? How high are you in neuroticism? How high are you? And you will get a quantitative value assessment, and from that you can make a nice qualitative assessment of what your personality is like. You can identify very, very clearly and in an unequivocal, in no mystery, a very, very precise way, where is your strengths, where is your weaknesses, so that you know where it is that you can balance out your personality, whether you need to be a bit more assertive, whether you need to be a bit more whatever. And if you're high in neuroticism, that will explain to you, oh, I am here, I'm inclined to depression, all these kinds, and you can go. And I would recommend that if you are finding that you are at the point where you constant fear and anxiety and panic attacks and things like that, I would suggest maybe consider, maybe there was a trauma in your life. It might be a good idea for you to receive some proper actual, not counseling for empaths and all that and that nonsense. That's rubbish. Go and do some cognitive behavioral therapy. Go and maybe even look at PTSD, if there were a therapy for PTSD or even complex PTSD. Right, go and get some therapy for that. They will be very, very effective. They will be able to help you, and those are well-established avenues for which can help you manage your issues. And even for those people who have a fear, maybe a little bit of agoraphobia, you can even go and do something they call exposure therapy, where you get exposed slowly but surely to the thing that you are afraid of, and you find that by doing this, you naturally naturally develop the skill known as bravery. How you learn how to be brave, and that's a very, very good skill to learn, because bravery generalizes not only with that one thing, but generalizes it in all areas of your life. And it then obviously becomes very, very useful. So usually what happens is your therapist, whether it's the cognitive, the CBT, the cognitive behavioral, or the PTSD therapy, they might in fact go and put you into that kind of sort of therapy. And that can be very, very useful. I will link these articles which I put there just so that you can see what they're talking about more or less. And but you will see very, very straight away if you go and you look at so here's an interesting thing, right? Have a look here, right? Tragic or violent events on TV can completely incapacitate you, right? So you need to know that what you have, if that is true, you're basically at a point where you're actually almost completely dysfunctional. If even a TV program can traumatize you to such a point that you incapacitated, right? If a television program is going to do that to you, how much more so the real world? You need to try and figure out how to get out of these kinds of things, you know? So I'm going to link these articles where they're talking about empaths, but I am putting that, I'm linking them with the clear and express statement that empath, the category empath, does not exist. Does not exist. What you're dealing with when you're talking about an empath, what you are actually realistically dealing with is someone who is on the spectrum, on the high end of the spectrum of agreeableness, someone who is on the high end of the spectrum of neuroticism, and someone who is possibly, well, I'm not saying this is everyone, who is possibly also experiencing either a personality disorder, borderline, or histrionic, or codependent, or even might be suffering because of some trauma, might be suffering from PTSD or something like that. That is literally the kind of person that either will be some of those or all of those, if you are finding that these kinds of things speak to you, right? Go and do your personality test. Once you understand who you are, what your personality is like, then you can actually work from there. And ladies and gentlemen, if you have any questions, go ahead, you know, leave it down below. But I have found this Big 5 personality trait test to be absolutely spectacular, to give everyone a solid foundation, a solid, scientific, reliable, predictable, explanatory power, explanatory scope basis for you to understand what you are like, what you are going through, and how you're going to react in certain things, to be able to realistically identify your strengths and identify your weaknesses, and then progress from there to then be able to understand, where do I need to go from here in terms of my therapy? What do I look, where can I look for help? And then even once you get to the therapist, you can even take your personality trait along with them. That will help if your therapist is up to date on these kinds of things. Your therapist will look at it and will understand you straight away and see, oh, all right, will actually be quite useful. If you have a competent therapist, will actually be quite useful to them to have that personality trait test. In fact, as far as I'm concerned, any professional worth their salt should, the first thing they should do is administer the Big Five personality trait test, so that they know from the get-go more or less what they are dealing with in terms of the individual, because people can lie, right? People can lie, or they can exaggerate, and all of these kinds of things. And the test will help the medical professional sort of suss out whether the person is going too far, or where they're coming and going. It gives them a good springboard into the therapy session to know what they're dealing, and even you as an individual to have that solid validation, because it's helpful to have that solid, sound validation. Right, this is an objective standard or measurement of what I am really like, rather than just be floating around wondering with these endless platitudes and these endless things that you find on the internet, where they give you a little bit of insight, but they ultimately they take you nowhere. So, ladies and gentlemen, that is it. I hope that helps you out a lot. I hope you can find, if you find that you are in these kinds of issues, let me know if this helps you. If you're in these kinds of issues, I hope you find healing. I hope you find a way out and stuff like that. Find people that you can trust and all these kinds of things. And I really wish you all the best. I didn't make this video because I'm trying to bash you or trying to whatever the case might be, but I actually want you to recover, right? I'm not the type of person, I'm making no money off these videos. None whatsoever. I'm literally, I gain nothing from doing this, except that I want people to actually recover. I don't want to see, I disagree this business where people sit for 10, 15, 20, 30 years in therapy and they never get better. Right? Which is a big problem with a lot of psychology and a lot of psychologists out there, and I've had people, even in my own family, in therapy for year after year after year. Nothing gets better. In fact, in a lot of times, they get worse. It's because one thing we need to realize, just because the person has a qualification, has MD, or whatever the case next to their name, it does not mean they're any good whatsoever. Does not mean that they are any good whatsoever. In fact, there is a high prevalence of people who are actually damaged themselves within the psychological profession, because a lot of people go into that profession trying to understand their own issues and all these kinds of things. They don't do particularly well, and then when they go with therapy and do therapy with other people, rather than remain objective to actually help the person, they tend to then superimpose their own views, rather than be objective, superimpose themselves upon other people. And then that's a problem. That's a problem, because you're dealing with individuals who have nothing to do with you. You're there to get people better, to get people healthy, so one day they can stand on their own 2 feet and live their own lives as an independent, healthy individual who can go out and stake their own claim in life. And that's why I'm making this video. So I want people to actually have a proper direction and have something that is legitimate and can actually give you proper knowledge, so you can move forward in a constructive way, so you'll actually get somewhere. I've seen far too many people spend years upon years in therapy and get absolutely nowhere. It's disgusting. It is one of the shames of the psychological industry, is that such things go on. At all. And they never get better. Granted, this is very, very difficult issues, right? A lot of this knowledge we haven't had for a very long time, right? These are difficult. Studying the human mind is the most complicated thing we've ever had to study, ever, without exception, right? Acknowledge, yes, it is difficult, but progress has been made, and you can go and look at these kinds of things and get some actual help and some actual insight, rather than the pseudoscientific, occult, new age nonsense which you find out there, that makes that if anything is at best completely ineffective and does nothing, and at worst will actually make you worse. You can't have that. And the problem is, even in the church, even in the Christian church, it's one of the reasons why I'm doing it, even in the Christian church, right? Ignorance of these issues makes Christians ineffective at their evangelism, makes them ineffective at outreach, right? A lot of Christians I see, they go out there and they do nothing but make things worse, right? Because a lot of Christians are so arrogant that they imagine that as long as I care enough that I can go out and just interfere in people's lives, in the highly complicated, very complicated issues, that I can just go and do whatever I want and just tell people, pray about it. That's why people get sick and tired of Christians. These are deep, complicated issues that require competence, that require knowledge. And you get these Christians, they go out there and they face people with these severe issues, and rather than actually help them in a competent way, pray about it. And that's why people get sick and tired of Christians. The stupidity, the ignorance, right? The absolute, it's nonsense. So if we want to be effective as Christians, and if Christians want to stop making things worse, they need to go out there and they need to be competent and study the mind and understand what they're doing, right? You're dealing with lives, with real human lives, complicated human lives, complicated minds. You don't just go out there uninformed and unqualified and imagine that you're going to make things better rather than worse. It's simply nonsensical. And there are a lot of people out there with letters of profession next to their names who also are completely useless because their training has made them of no effect. You need to get it right. And it upsets me because I'm actually somewhat compassionate. I'm actually above average compassion for as far as men are concerned. I'm above average. Men average at about the 35th or 36th percentile. I'm in the 43rd percentile for compassion. So I'm a little bit higher, right? Not quite as high as most women, but I'm high on average because I actually care. And it absolutely aggravates me to no end when I see people pushing these pseudoscientific nonsense, idiotic ideas that helps no one, and people go on to suffer needlessly for years and years and never find any help. They get nothing but platitudes and memes and inspirational videos and inspirational quotes and all this flowery garbage, but their lives don't change. Just because you bring in fluffiness and pillows and inspirational quotations and ribbons, and it doesn't mean you're going to get better. You need to get in there and do the hard work. It's frightening. I know. I've seen people do it. It's frightening. It's tough. I'm telling you now, it's tough to get yourself right, really 100%. I've got issues, man. Let me tell you, I've got issues as well. I didn't have, my childhood was a bit rough and all these kinds of things. So believe me, I'm no stranger. Rough to change these things about yourself and acknowledge certain things about yourself, right? It's rough, but you gotta, if you want to get better, you really want to get better, you gotta put in that work, man. You gotta put in that work, and you gotta get it right. You gotta get your ducks in a row. Anyway, I've waffled on for too long. Ladies and gentlemen, I hope this helps you. God bless me. God bless you, man. Seriously, my sister, my brother, I hope you come right. I hope you can find your peace and find your healing and all that kind of stuff, and even though I said that there's a lot of this might sound ironic, but getting your spirituality right, God can help you with all of this, because we're spiritual beings as well. We're not just physical, and that's one of the mistakes that a lot of these people make, right? Where they say empaths can feel the molecular essence of a person. It's like your essence isn't molecular, your essence isn't physical, your essence is spiritual. And if you don't get the spiritual aspect sorted out, you're not going to be whole. Not going to be whole at all. Anyway, ladies and gentlemen, take it easy. Good mental health to you. Cheerio, goodbye, and God bless.